how have you witnessed the impact of the advocacy on the ground, especially in the areas of female gender advocacy?
Sure. Thank you very much, first of all. Thank you, Gabriel, for having me on the show. It is exciting to be here and to share my work, but also my opinion about things that are happening in the continent and beyond. In relation to your question, I wanted to approach it in two parts because, as you know, my work, which is at the intersection of legal as well as social legal scholarship and research, advocacy, whether in the legal setting or otherwise, rights-based education, both in the academic as well as in the non-academic setting, as well as advocacy and public policy. I do the work both at the national level, in a sense. As you may know, I'm originally from the Gambia, but also regionally as well. So in relation to the Gambia, so I started as a child right activist when I was 8 years old. And so activism has basically been a key part of my journey and my life in very much as it relates to especially the historical trajectory of the Gambia. In relation to that, when I was quite young, as I said, at the age of 8, but most especially in the early 2000s, when I was very much involved in quite a number of initiatives that pop up, because at that time, there was the need and the focus for children's rights activists, but also the voices of children, especially in conversations that were ongoing. So for instance, I was a founding member of Voice of the Young, which is a child-led advocacy group under the Child Protection Alliance, also a member of the National Youth Parliament, Lend a Hand Society, as well as the Gender Action Team. And then I think for me, what was also interesting at that very young age in 2002 was that I was elected through a national competitive search as the first Gambian representative to the World Student Parliament. So I came into so this is the space that I sort of came in. And at that point, I think partly is also acknowledging that, especially at that time, already, the face of dictatorship was showing in the early 2000s, but also at that particular point as well, there was the conversation, about acknowledging that the Gambian society was and still is patriarchal in a sense. And also at that point as well, gender-based violence was prevalent. But I think one of the key things that came out, particularly at that time, was that the legal and policy framework was not enough to protect either children or women and girls. And so part of the work that I did, especially through those organizations, was, for instance, and one of the outcomes of that was the enactment of the Children's Act of 2005, the enactment of the Women's Act of 2010, which later we had amendments to both the Women's Act 2015, which led to their prohibition of female genital mutilation, but also as it relates to the Children's Amendment Act prohibiting child marriage. The work that I did also with coordinating the Female Lawyers Association of the Gambia also was partly contributed to that work, especially as it relates to enactment of both the Domestic Violence as well as the Sexual Offences Act of 2013. So part of the work and the impact, I believe, is really around legal advocacy, but also with regard to, having the laws are beautiful, obviously, which has been great, but obviously implementation has always been a challenge in the Gambia and beyond. And just quickly, in terms of my regional work that I did, especially as it relates to supporting the African human rights system, has really been through, for example, the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, where I did both my master's as well as my doctorate. And there I was a technical advisor to several of the special rapporteurs on the rights of women with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And there, in addition to building state capacity as well as civil society capacity as it relates to engagement with the African human rights system, I think part of the work that I did, which has been impactful, I hope, has really been in terms of drafting legal norms and standards. So for instance, I was very much part of drafting at least the first draft and doing the background research as a student then of the University of Pretoria as it relates to General Comment number 1, which was on Article 14.1 of the African Women's Protocol, or commonly known as the Maputo Protocol, which focused on the issues of HIV. And over the years, I have been very much involved in, for instance, the Joint General Comment of the African Commission, as well as the African Committee of Experts on ending child marriage. We recently also had one on ending FGM, but also as it relates to drafting the shadow reporting guidelines to the African Commission, as well as General Comment number 6, which relates to issues of rights of women, especially in cases of divorce and annulment as well. So as you can see, obviously there are a couple of things, but I think especially at the regional level, in terms of articulating guidance, especially as it relates to what are state obligations, especially when it comes to protecting and ensuring the full realization of the rights of women in Africa, I think has been more impactful. And also to acknowledge that obviously I did a bit of the work, but it is in collaboration with incredible people across the continent, but also collaboratively with institutions like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and other institutions as well.
That's quite impressive. Moving ahead, that's really quite impressive. I wouldn't want to bore you because of we have a limited time with so much details. I would like to know more about your work. But moving on, I would like to ask you, on January 8th this year, one of the former minister in the Gambian government, Usman Sonko, was set on trial by the Swiss authorities. And some people have been saying that the Gambian government, led by the current president, President Barrow, have not made any formal requests for his extradition. But also, considering that some of the Swiss authorities have traveled to and fro, interviewed a lot of people, and it seems there is a credible evidence to go on with the prosecution in Switzerland. Do you think if the Gambian government finally decide to request for a formal extradition, do you think that the victims will get fair trials in the Gambia?
Sure. Yes, I do believe that a fair trial is assured, if, for instance, he was extradited to the Gambia. I think for me personally, I place my belief in the integrity of our judicial system, obviously including the Ministry of Justice. And that comes with the backdrop and a caveat, obviously, that within the Gambian context, we know that judicial independence was very much impacted during the Jammeh regime, leading to, sort of a lack of trust in the judicial process, but also legitimacy as well. And partly that also came into being as part of what we've seen with what we call, quote unquote, the machinery judges during the Jammeh regime, right? Where he was able to hire and fire foreign judges, and which obviously invariably impacted judicial independence. I have done a bit of research around this, and recently I contributed a book chapter on foreign judges on the Gambian bench and its implication for judicial independence as part of the Cambridge Handbook of Foreign Judges on Domestic Courts. Acknowledging this, I think, but also understanding the current context that we find ourselves, right? So obviously the Gambia is going through a transition from an authoritarian regime to a democratic state. And part of it, as I said, really is also understanding that, the judicial independence was impacted as it relates to that. Currently, and since the new government came into being, that has been one of the major focus, which has been really the restructuring of the judicial system. One of the key areas that we saw that really is as it relates to sort of the trend moving from hiring foreign judges as the Chief Justice of the Gambia and really focusing on what we now call the Gambianization of the judiciary. So for instance, our current Chief Justice Hassan Jallow, who was the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, is now the Chief Justice. He is a Gambian. Majority since he was appointed, I can say that I do believe that all of the Superior Court judges are now Gambians. That is one of the key areas that they really focused on in terms of building trust, in terms of ensuring legitimacy, as well as rebuilding the trust of the Gambian people in the judiciary as well. Part of what we've also seen, especially as it relates to prosecution, going back to your question, is that there are also illustrative examples as well. So for instance, we had the successful prosecution of Yankuba Baji and others who, for instance, were convicted of the murder of Solo Sandeng, who was, as we know, one of an inspiring figure in the opposition, which is the opposition party, particularly the United Democratic Party, and led, for instance, peaceful protests back in 2016, which led to his arrest, and then subsequently he was murdered. These people were successfully prosecuted within the context. And I think the other example as well is the case of Yankuba Toure, who we know was part of the original group of Jammeh's team that actually did the coup d'etat back in 1994. He was successfully convicted of the murder of Usman Koro Sise, who was the former Minister of Finance. And part of what we've seen really, given the fact that that was very much connected to one of the key processes that happened in the Gambia, but also continuously the work is ongoing, is the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission's work. And what we've seen, especially in the case of Yankuba Toure, was that the Supreme Court actually denied his claims of immunity through the 1997 Constitution. So this is all to say that whilst there is the backdrop, obviously, of executive power and interference during the Jammeh regime, what we've really seen, despite the fact that there are and continues to be challenges as well, is that the judiciary is at a level in which it can assure and ensure fair trial, both for the accused, but also ensuring that justice as well as closure for the victims in the Gambia is possible if he is extradited.
Still on extradition, is there any international mechanism that the Gambian government is obligated to follow, considering that the former president, Jammeh himself, is still within the African continent?
Right.
And can Gambia request for him to be extradited to face prosecution?
Sure. I think it's not the asking. I think it's there are other factors to it, right? And there are sort of quote unquote two camps, especially as it relates to extraditing Jammeh to face to face the crimes that he committed during his 22 years of authoritarian regime. I think partly there are current efforts. As I said, what we've seen obviously is the implementation currently of the white paper as well as the recommendations from the TRRC. Prosecution obviously is planned, especially for certain categories of violators. And part of this has been envisaged, for instance, that there will be a hybrid court set up in the Gambia that addresses that. So that's one arm, right? But however, also the second arm has been, and the conversation has been about this idea of potentially Jammeh being put on trial in another ECOWAS country, right? Part of the argument as it relates to this, I think, is also acknowledging that whilst there is evidence, enough and ample evidence to show the things that Jammeh committed, especially human rights violations that Jammeh committed during his 22 years of rule, he still has substantial support, right? Particularly political support from the general populace in the Gambia, but also the military as well. So I think partly as well have been this conversation about what will it mean to extradite Jammeh in the Gambia and face prosecution when he has that sort of substantial support and the potential security implications for that. I am no security expert, so just a disclaimer, but that has really been part of the conversation about the viability of bringing Jammeh to the Gambia to actually face trial or potentially explore. As you may know, obviously, the Gambia is a member of ECOWAS, which has been recently very much central to the news. But that membership also gives us the space, for instance, to explore potentially other geographical locations for his prosecution. And this is nothing new, right? We've seen sort of evidence as it relates to that.
So in essence, President Adama Barrow is trying to avoid those crises, internal security issues, by shifting it to others that might be willing to take the responsibilities.
Well, not speaking on behalf of what the aspirations and the goals of President Barrow is, but as I said, I think from my general reading, especially being part of some of those conversations, really has been in terms of weighing those concerns, and which are also valid concerns, right? Because, for instance, as you may know, we still have external support as it relates to the security presence of external allies in the Gambia who are responsible for the Gambia's security. So I do think that there is valid concern as it relates to that. But I also think part of the conversation, obviously, has also been in terms of capacity, especially as it relates to the judicial system in relation to Jame. Jame was part, and I wouldn't say my age, right? But Jame was basically a majority part of my life was under Jame's rule, right? And this is true for quite a number of people in the Gambia, considering the fact that Gambia has a very young, youthful population. More than 50% of the population is actually young people. And so all we knew was the Jame regime, right? But also prior to that as well, you also have our parents, our grandparents, who were very much ingrained into sort of the autocratic, the autocratic ideals, not necessarily autocratic, but the vision that he sold. Because Jammeh, as a dictator, was able to use a multitude of tools and tactics to ensure and entrench his power. So I do think there are valid concerns to questions around extraditing Jammeh to the Gambia. But I also think one thing that we all agreed on is that he needs to face, he needs to be brought and held accountable for the violations that he committed during his 22 years of rule.
How do you see initiatives such as Yame for Justice in fostering and holding leaders accountable in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I give it to the Yame to Justice initiative as well as others, because I do think that, one of the reasons why, the transition happened, quote unquote, the transition happened back in 2017, 2016, was also part of like those broader initiatives that actually support and raise attention as it relates to violations that are happening in country. I do think that, such initiatives are important. One, in relation to bringing the international attention. I think that is really one of the greatest things of their contribution, right? Because unlike, for instance, local activists and local groups, they have a platform, right? They have a platform. They are able to connect to international organizations to actually ask them to put pressure on the government, whether that was the Jammeh government or, now whether it's the Barrow government, in relation to ensuring that they are exercising their responsibilities and fulfilling their obligations. So I think beyond the Gambian context, initiatives like the Jammeh to Justice is important, both in relation to bringing attention, but also as in relate to connecting the dots as well, because I do think, one of the things that those sort of initiatives really bring as well is that human rights violations and the things that we see, especially as it relates to dictatorship, is not just a Gambian problem, right? We've seen evidence of it in so many African countries, well, and beyond, but given the context that we're talking about, that these initiatives are important in terms of movement building. I do think that one of the things that can be strengthened in relation to not just the Jammeh to Justice, but just broadly in terms of movement building, is really also connecting the international to the local. Because sometimes that whilst the international initiative might have inroads, as we said, especially as it relates to international attention, ensuring that connection to the grassroots, especially the folks that are doing the day-to-day work, is vital, because then their lived experiences are very much important in sort of centering the call and the conversation around some of these violations and holding the perpetrators accountable.
Can you tell us more about the work you've been doing as a member of the strategic panel of experts of the strategic litigation in Africa? I think your work has been mentioned in numerous publications, which I've read some of them, but for the benefit of our audience who might not know some of the things that you have done, can you shed light on one particular event or case that is prominent?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I do a very small, I contribute very, very small to the work of ISLA, but I am, I am grateful to be in that community. ISLA, as you mentioned, the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, it's headquartered in South Africa, but it is a Pan-African organization that really focuses on legal advocacy, but also particularly, especially in terms of strategy, around strategic litigation around women's rights as well as sexual rights. The work that I have been doing through the panel of experts for ISLA has really been contributing to knowledge generation, especially around some of the issue areas that we are dealing with, for example, sexual harassment in the workplace, but also broadly on violence against women, as well. And then also capacity building. So I have been very much involved in, some of the work in relation to capacity building of lawyers, right? So ISLA has the Feminist Litigation Network, which is really focused on bringing women lawyers across the continent and building their capacity and providing long-term support so that they can engage in strategic litigation processes. And recently, I was able to contribute a module on sexual harassment during the Feminist Litigation Institute that was really focused on women's social and economic rights. ISLA does incredible work around strategic litigation. I mean, we could spend the whole day just talking about strategies of strategic litigation and potential impact of strategic litigation on the ground, and challenges as well as other factors, and how to measure even impact, right? But I do think one of the key areas that they've really been looking into, and which also is very much connected for me, which I also found interesting. So I did mention earlier that I was part of the process of developing the general comment number 6 on Article 7 of the Maputo Protocol, which is focused on the women's right, especially as it relates to distribution of property during divorce as well as annulment. And one of the cases that ISLA did in Kenya was really around this, but beyond that. So for instance, ISLA came into the case as an amicus curiae. So for other folks, it's like friends of the court. It's not necessarily they are the ones that brought the case, but they are able to provide additional information and legal arguments around a particular issue. And for ISLA, I think that's really one of their strengths in terms of being able to come in when you have women rights organizations, you have women rights, especially women lawyers organizations across the continent instituting cases. ISLA comes in and provides additional support as it relates to that. But one of the cases that they really delve into, as I mentioned, is the case in which the Supreme Court of Kenya recently extended protection of property rights in marriage to all forms of family forming units. So what this case was really about was that, and it is the first decision of the Supreme Court of Kenya in which they made a decision as it relates to division of matrimonial property when it is like long-term cohabitation and marriage that is not recognized by law. Because in most cases, what we've seen, especially as it relates to the lived experiences of women, is that they might be cohabiting with a partner, not necessarily have any sort of long-term interest in marriage or have something legally on paper, but however, during the course of the long-term habitation, obviously then they accrued property right. So, but in most cases, at the end of the day, they do not have the legal recourse to be able to have access to that property when that cohabitation, quote unquote, ends, because it is not legally recognized by law. So what ISLA really did, especially what its submission was really coming in to explain to the court, because that's what an amicus curiae is meant to be, or a friend of the court is meant to be, to illustrate how division of property, especially during cohabitation, should ideally, especially when we are considering issues of equality, should be ideally distributed the same way it would have ideally been done if it was a legally recognized union. And so the court really took the submission of ISLA, especially in highlighting some of their international as well as the regional minimum benchmarks as it relates to some of these issues, and really came out with edition, the first edition of its kind, recognizing, for example, distribution of property, during cases of, in cohabitated unions or marriages, or marriages that are not legally recognized by law. I think what strategic litigation does a lot of things, right? But I do think what this one did is really trying to ensure that there is clarity in the law, right? There is no uncertainty as it relates to that what is applicable to this certain context will be applicable to another context, especially in ensuring women's access to justice and having a legal recourse. And I mean, we go on and on about the numerous cases, obviously, that they've contributed to, but I really find this one very interesting as it relates to their contribution, especially in terms of clarifying to the court, but also guiding the court to come to that particular decision, which has been helpful. And I think in a sense as well, when we are thinking about long-term impact, what the Supreme Court decision then will ultimately result in potentially will be a law that clarifies some of these issues, and which will be very much grounded in the decision that came out of the Supreme Court.
As the director of Human Rights Center in University of Dayton, you obviously have a lot of African students, and not just African students, but also students from other parts of the world that wants to know more about things you have done, your experiences, and you have a curriculum that you use to teach with your experience and the theory of what you teach. How do you balance your experience so that your students will be able to practicalize it in real life scenario?
Sure. So the University of Dayton Human Rights Center is an incredible place. I'm not just saying that because you're seeing the University of Dayton behind me, but the Human Rights Center is an innovative transdisciplinary hub that really focuses on at the nexus of education, advocacy, and research, right? And so that creates incredible opportunities, as you indicated, both in terms of curriculum development, education, but also what we really focused on here at the University of Dayton, especially with regard to impactful experiential learning opportunities. So as you indicated, obviously, given my sort of regional expertise with the African human rights system, I have my work, especially as it relates to some of the focus areas of the Human Rights Center, has focused on, as you indicated, developing and teaching the human rights and development in Africa course, for example, that really focuses on issues from the continent, which is really nice because the reality is in most cases, especially in Western universities, right, quite a number of the African studies or the African related courses are taught by non-Africans. Right. So it is nice to be an African and teaching about Africa, because I do think, especially when we think about, the dangers of a single story, it is important that as Africans with our lived experiences, we are able to articulate that in the classroom. So that's one. But also, I think for me and the rest of the Human Rights Center team, we've really been focused on, as I said, especially partnerships across global divides and how that sort of connects to students' experiential learning opportunities. So in my class, one of the things that I do is actually bring human rights practitioner into the class, right? Because quite a number of the students have never been to Africa before, right? All they know about Africa is things that they read from the news, which obviously we know, and can have a whole conversation about biased reporting about Africa, might be potentially directed in one way. So bringing human rights practitioners both virtually but also in person has really been, I think for me, one of the key takeaways from the students as it relates to the content of the class. And we have also been able to do this because one of the things that we did last year, so the Human Rights Center usually organizes biennial social practice of human rights conference. And last year we organized a joint convening with the University of Pretoria as well as the University of the Free State on the theme of decolonization and development for African people of African descent. It was a convening that really brought together not just scholars, but researchers, activists, artists, and it was like an incredible space where the student of ours from the University of Dayton, but also beyond, we're able to engage with people from across the continent, from across the African continent, but also from Latin America, as well as the Caribbean. That sort of space was really, I think, for me, inspiring for the students, but also served as an avenue to showcase how people are actually doing the work that they're doing on the ground, right, in real life. Then finally, just on that as well, I think one of the other key areas that we have recently really focused on, as I mentioned, is with regard to our international human rights fellowships. So I am so excited about this because last summer we had 11 University of Dayton students in various African countries spending the whole summer working with our partners, and our partners varied from grassroots organizations like Dandelion in Kenya, to Warm Hub in South Africa, to the National Human Rights Commission in the Gambia, as well as the Initiative for Gender Equality and Development in Ghana, and Afrobarometer in Ghana as well. So we have varied partners. And so we had our students, for instance, in these countries, really supporting the work of our partners. But also, I think, most importantly for us as well, is really seeing that one of the things that I try to articulate in my class, especially as it relates to engagement with communities, is ensuring that we're not doing research on communities, but we're doing research with communities or engaging with communities, and not coming in and thinking that we are the experts because we are from the US, we have all the answers. That's not true. The people, I think for us, and that is really where the Human Rights Center really shines, because we're very much interested in how and that is why we have the whole concept of the social practice of human rights, which is really premised on how the everyday person enacts human rights in their everyday lives, whether that's through arts, whether that's through activism, and really the experiences that our students have, incredible experiences our students have going into these various African countries and working with communities, you know, in very small ways, contributing to their work has really been impactful as it relates to both their current trajectory, but also in relation to their future careers as well. And I think for me, one of the key takeaways for that is really around just being there is around cultural competence and cultural humility rather. As I mentioned, really the idea and the premise is that students are really going in and learning from the community. And that has been, you know, for me, that has been really one of the biggest initiatives that I have been engaged in and very excited about it. Not just because I'm African. I mean, you know, I have to center Africa. Obviously, I do think, you know, Africa is important. Recently, there was this New York Times post that talks about how in 2050, one in 4 people will be African. So Africa, you know, despite our challenges, Africa has a key role to play in the global discourse. And I think for us, especially higher education institutions, whether in the US, whether, you know, in Europe or elsewhere, I do think there is value in terms of ensuring that the education that we provide for our students is international education, but also has opportunities to engage in real life projects that impacts the lives of everyday people, and which we can learn from and bring back to the US or wherever to also share, especially in terms of the innovative and creative ways of organizing and campaigning and doing the work that is being done by the incredible people in various spaces in Africa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nabaneh. It's been an amazing experience for you sharing your expertise and experiences with us on 60 Minutes Africa tonight. Because of time, we wouldn't have to extend more, but hopefully some other time we'll hope to invite you for you to give us more life experiences as you progress in your journey towards projecting Africa in positive light. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you very much. And this has been I know quite short, but very amazing in terms of having this conversation. Come back anytime. And I do think it is important, as we said, to center Africa, but also recognizing the incredible work that is being done by civil society actors, by governments, you know, by everyone else. But also the need to think around intersectional organizing and new ways. Let me repeat that, and new ways of doing things especially as it relates to the work that we do focused on the continent and beyond. Thank you again, Gabriel, for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
You too.